There is a number that requires no context or explanation: 330,000. That is the number of soldiers that the 6th German Army had with them when they crossed the Don River in the summer of 1942, marching toward a city on the banks of the Volga that bore the name of the man Adolf Hitler hated the most. 330,000 soldiers with 3 years of consecutive victories etched into their bodies, men who had crossed all of Europe without knowing defeat, who had destroyed entire armies and captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners in encirclement maneuvers that history books still study with awe. The forging of a war machine, origin and doctrine of the 6th Army. The 6th Army was formally established in October 1939, just weeks after the end of the Polish campaign. It did not emerge from nowhere. It was the reorganization of the 10th Army, which had fought on that first front of the war, transferred to the West on October 10, 1939, and renamed under the command of General der Infanterie Walter von Reichenau. But to understand what this army really was, what made it different from any other formation of its size in the world at that time, it is necessary to go even further back, to the very nature of the doctrine that animated it and to the men that doctrine had produced. Germany had gone from having an army of 100,000 men, the limit imposed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, to deploying millions of soldiers in less than a decade. This transformation was logistical and industrial, but also, and above all, doctrinal. The army that Versailles had left alive, the Reichswehr of 100,000 men, was paradoxically the laboratory where the ideas that would transform it were incubated. Deprived of the possibility of having tanks, military aviation, and heavy artillery, the officers of the Reichswehr spent the 1920s studying. They studied the war they had just lost, sought the reasons for the German collapse in 1918, analyzed the armored experiments of the British and the French, and arrived at conclusions that their European rivals took decades to assimilate. But there was something even more fundamental, something that is often omitted when describing the German army of that era: the Auftragstaktik, the mission tactic. Its history is older than the 20th century. Its roots lie in the Prussian military reforms of the first half of the 19th century, in the thought of Clausewitz, and in the operational practice of Marshal Helmut von Moltke, the elder during the wars of German unification. Auftragstaktik started from a premise that its rivals found difficult to accept. The battlefield is inherently chaotic and unpredictable, and any detailed plan begins to degrade the moment contact is made with the enemy. Consequently, the solution was not to plan in greater detail, but to train officers at all levels to act with initiative within the framework of the overall objectives assigned. In the German army of 1939 to 1942, a battalion commander who identified an opportunity on the battlefield had not only the authority, but the obligation to act on it without waiting for orders from above. They were assigned a goal: take that village, cross that river, neutralize that battery, not a method. Initiative was a cardinal virtue. A commander who awaited detailed instructions when the situation changed was considered a failure, regardless of their rank. A commander who acted without orders but correctly identified the superior objective and contributed to its achievement was praised, even if they had violated the letter of the plan. This culture produced middle commanders capable of making quick and correct decisions under pressure, which made German units move with a speed and coordination that their enemies took years to understand and even longer to imitate. The training system that produced these officers was equally demanding. The Kriegsakademie, the War Academy, selected its candidates through a series of tests that lasted months and evaluated not only tactical and operational knowledge, but the ability to reason under pressure, clarity in written expression, geographical and logistical understanding, and independent judgment. The selected officers spent years learning to write concise orders, to analyze complex tactical situations, and to understand the perspective of both higher and lower levels simultaneously. The result was a corps of professional officers whose technical competence was, in the period 1939 to 1942, unparalleled in the world. The 6th Army absorbed this philosophy from its birth under von Reichenau. Walter von Reichenau was born in 1884 in Karlsruhe, the son of a Prussian general. He was a man who embodied the contradictions of the German officer of that era, a brilliant strategist, a convinced military technocrat, a rigorous athlete, running marathons and practicing extreme sports at an age when his colleagues played chess in the officers' casino, and at the same time one of the most ideologically committed officers to the Nazi regime within the High Command. Unlike most of his aristocratic peers, von Reichenau had actively cultivated his relationship with Hitler since the early 1930s and had served as an intermediary between the party and the army during the rise to power. His ideology was documented in the Schärfebefehl, the Order of Severity, which he issued on October 10, 1941 for the Sixth Army, instructing his men on what he described as the duty to exterminate the Jewish Asiatic threat and to consider Soviet political commissars as representatives of a subhumanity that did not deserve the protection of the laws of war. The document was distributed on the Eastern Front at Hitler's request, who presented it as a model for the other army commanders. It was one of the first official documents in which a field commander articulated genocide as part of the ordinary military mission. The Sixth Army units delivered captured Jews and commissars to the Einsatzgruppen and the Feldgendarmerie, as occurred in the Kiev region in September 1941, including the massacre at Babin Yar, where more than 33,000 people were killed in 2 days. But his tactical influence on the Sixth Army was equally real and profound. He established a culture of initiative at the intermediate command level, of rapid decision-making, of sustained aggression that would persist long after he left command. The officers of the Sixth Army learned that slowness was a vice and audacity a virtue, that the momentum of combat was an asset lost the moment the advance was stopped, and that uncertainty was never an excuse for inaction. That culture would take the Sixth Army from Poland to Kiev, and from Kiev to the banks of the Volga. It would also be, in the decisive hours of the Stalingrad encirclement, the culture that Paulus did not embody, and that his army urgently needed. The organizational structure that the Sixth Army would have at its peak was generally composed of 4 army corps: the 8th Armée Corps, the 11th Armée Corps, the 14th Panzer Corps, and the 51st Armée Corps. The most powerful corps in terms of maneuverability was the 14th Panzer Corps, led by General der Panzertruppe Hans Valentin Huber, which grouped the armored and motorized divisions, the 3rd Motorized Infantry Division, the 60th Motorized Infantry Division, the 94th Infantry Division, the 16th Panzer Division, and eventually fractions of the 14th and 24th. These formations were the sharp edge of the army, capable of advancing 40 or 50 kilometers in a day across open terrain, bypassing enemy positions and sowing chaos in the rear. The infantry corps provided the mass and sustained combat capability, securing terrain, reducing defensive positions, eliminating pockets left by the armored cavalry behind them. This was further complemented by integration with the Luftwaffe, particularly with the 8th Fliegerkorps under General-Lieutenant Martin Fiebig, which assigned Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers and fighter bombers for close air support to ground units with speed and effectiveness that no other army in the world had been able to perfect. The Stuka pilots supporting the Sixth Army during the years of victories brought vertical warfare to the battlefield, attacking enemy artillery, destroying bridges over rivers and disrupting armored concentrations before they reached the front. The communications system coordinating those attacks, with Luftwaffe liaison officers embedded in the headquarters of the Ground Corps, was the invisible backbone of that combined power. All of this, the doctrine, the men, the structure, the integration with aviation, was what made the Sixth Army unprecedented in German military history and, at that time, in world military history. It was a war machine fine-tuned by 3 years of real combat, by victories that confirmed the validity of its founding principles, and by the accumulated experience of hundreds of thousands of men who had learned to function together under fire. That accumulated experience, that capital of tactical competence and institutional cohesion, was an asset that could not be manufactured in a factory or delivered through replacement reinforcements. It could only be earned in combat, and once lost, it could not be recovered. Barbarossa, the Sixth Army on the Eastern Front. On June 22, 1941, along a front of more than 3,000 kilometers, Germany launched the most ambitious operation in its military history, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For this campaign, the Sixth Army was assigned to the Southern Army Group under the command of General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt. Its mission was to advance from southern Poland and Ukraine toward the Donbas and the Caucasus, the industrial and oil-rich regions that Hitler considered essential to sustain the German war machine in the long term. What they found upon crossing the Soviet border was not what many had expected, though not for the reasons one might assume. The Red Army of 1941 was in a state of deep crisis. Stalin's purges between 1937 and 1938 had literally decapitated its officer corps. Thousands of generals, colonels, and experienced commanders had been executed or sent to forced labor camps. The units that faced the Germans in the early days of Barbarossa were often poorly led, poorly communicated, and in tactically inadequate positions. The results were catastrophic for the Soviets. The Sixth Army, along with armored units from the 1st Panzer Group under the command of Ewald von Kleist, participated in a series of encirclement battles that rank among the largest in military history. In the Battle of Kiev in September 1941, the forces of Army Group South closed a giant pocket around 4 entire Soviet armies from the southwestern front, commanded by General Polkovnik Mikhail Kiponos. The number of prisoners captured exceeded 600,000 men. There is no comparable precedent in the documented history of modern warfare. The Sixth Army was an integral part of this maneuver. Its infantry divisions closed the flanks of the encirclement, withstood desperate Soviet breakout attempts from both inside and outside, and held the pressure for weeks in an open plain terrain crisscrossed with rivers and ravines that offered little natural cover. "I don't know how many there were," an infantry officer from the Sixth Army who served during that period would recall decades later. "Endless columns for days. They marched westward with almost no one guarding them because we simply didn't have enough soldiers to escort them all." But the triumph at Kiev was also, though no one saw it that way at the time, a trap. Germany was winning battles of epic proportions while time was running out. The 1941 campaign had begun in June with the expectation of a victory within weeks. By October, the Red Army had suffered losses that would have destroyed any other army on the planet, and yet it still existed. It was still receiving reinforcements from the Urals and Siberia. It was still fighting. Winter arrived. The German advance came to a halt at the gates of Moscow. For the Sixth Army, that first Soviet winter was a test unlike anything that had come before. The men who had crossed Western Europe in a glorious summer now found themselves in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, without proper winter gear, holding defensive positions against Soviet counterattacks that came at night in the silence of the snowfall. German logistics, designed for a short war, groaned under the weight of a campaign that wouldn't end. "The cold was unlike anything I had imagined," wrote a soldier of the Sixth Army in a letter that didn't reach its destination until after the war. "It's not that it was cold and that was it. It was that the cold changed everything. Rifles jammed, engines wouldn't start, my feet stopped hurting because I couldn't feel them anymore. I knew that was worse, not better." And yet, the Sixth Army survived that winter. It absorbed the losses, held its lines, and entered the spring of 1942 still as a functional and combative force. Many German units on the Eastern Front were so decimated during that first winter that they had to be disbanded or reformed practically from scratch. The Sixth Army arrived battered but structurally intact. Its chain of command functioned. Its elite divisions maintained their cohesion. Its operational capacity was real. And yet the Sixth Army survived that winter. It absorbed the losses, held its lines, and entered the spring of 1942 still as a functional and combative force. Many German units on the Eastern Front were so decimated during that first winter that they had to be disbanded or reformed practically from scratch. The Sixth Army arrived battered but structurally intact. Its chain of command functioned. Its elite divisions maintained their cohesion. Its operational capacity was real. The Man and the Army. Friedrich Paulus takes command. On January 12, 1942, something happened that would change the fate of the Sixth Army in ways no one could have foreseen at the time. General Feldmarschall Walter von Reichenau suffered a collapse while on his morning run in Poltava. The doctors diagnosed him with a massive cerebral embolism. He was flown to Leipzig, where he died on January 17th. The man who replaced him at the helm of the Sixth Army was his former Chief of Staff, General der Panzertruppe Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus. The choice of Paulus was neither accidental nor improvised. Von Reichenau himself had suggested him to Hitler shortly before his death, convinced that his former collaborator was the most capable of the available candidates. Holder himself, Chief of Staff of the OKH, had supported Paulus's candidacy during the January 1942 crisis, when Paulus had helped maintain the coherence of command in the most pressured sectors of the Eastern Front during the Soviet counteroffensive that winter. He had the backing of the system. He had the trust of the men who held the power within the German High Command. What he did not have, and what no one within that system seemed to value enough at that moment, was the experience of leading in actual combat at the operational level. Friedrich Paulus was born on September 23, 1890 in Cuxhagen, a small town in what is now the state of Hesse. He was the son of Friedrich August Paulus, a school treasurer with no noble pretensions, and Bertha Lindenau. He came from a non-aristocratic family, a detail relevant in an army where the prefix von opened doors, although his movements and demeanor gave him a distinction that led many to mistake him for an aristocrat. He had attempted to join the Imperial Navy as a cadet without success, and briefly studied law at the University of Marburg before finally finding his way in the 111th Infantry Regiment of Baden in 1910 as a cadet officer. He married Elena Rosetti Solescu in 1912, a descendant of a Romanian aristocratic family whose social presence and ambition reinforced in him an awareness of his position. He fought in World War I as a junior officer on the Western and Eastern fronts and in the Balkans with mountain hunter units. He ended that war with the rank of captain and a solid reputation as a meticulous officer with organizational brilliance. During the Weimar period, he was selected for the small group of officers who would remain in the 100,000-man Reichswehr, which itself was a certificate of professional quality. Within that restricted framework, he perfected the skills that would define him, analyzing complex situations, drafting precise orders, and understanding logistics deeply, as well as the relationships between the various elements of combined arms. In the 1930s, with the rearmament of Germany, Paulus rapidly rose through the ranks of the General Staff. In 1935, he was appointed Chief of Staff of Guderian's Panzergruppe, participating from that position in the development of the tactical principles of the German armored force. In 1938, he was promoted to General Major. In 1939 and 1940, as Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the OKH, he participated in the planning of the first military campaigns, Poland, Norway, France, and the initial preparation for Barbarossa. His war game maps were legendary in their accuracy. His Lagebeurteilungen, situation assessments, were models of the genre. The men who worked for him respected him with an admiration that bordered on religious awe for someone who seemed to have eliminated human error from the military planning equation. What those same men noticed with less enthusiasm, though they rarely voiced it, was the difference between planning an operation and conducting it. Paulus had never commanded a unit larger than a battalion in actual combat before receiving the Sixth Army. His direct command experience was that of a company and battalion officer in World War I. Everything he had done after that had been in the realm of the General Staff, where the primary virtue was the precision of analysis and where the consequences of an erroneous judgment could be corrected on paper before they cost lives. In field command, the consequence of a wrong assessment was measured in dead men before the next dawn. His arrival at the command of the Sixth Army on January 20, 1942, coincided with one of the most difficult moments for the German forces on the Eastern Front. The Soviet counteroffensive of winter 1941 to 1942, launched in December by Marshal Zhukov, had pushed the forces of Army Group Center to the west and created pockets of German units holding out in isolated towns. The sector of Army Group South, where the Sixth Army operated, was relatively more stable, but the pressure was real. Paulus inherited an army battered by the first Soviet winter, with divisions that had suffered losses of between 30 and 50% in men and equipment, and with a logistics chain still creaking under the weight of a campaign that no one had designed to last more than 3 months. In that difficult context, Paulus demonstrated the virtues that made him a solid commander under ordinary conditions. He reorganized the army's sectors efficiently, ensured that the chain of command continued to function in the most pressured sectors, and maintained the cohesion of the units during the tactical retreat that the harsh winter forced to be carried out at several points. General der Artillerie Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 51st Army Corps and one of the most respected officers of the 6th, valued Paulus as an organizer and planner. What he questioned, privately in letters to other generals that would become historical documents, was Paulus's tendency to seek perfection in planning at the expense of tactical opportunity and his inability to make decisions when the situation was ambiguous. This inability to improvise was the flip side of the same coin that made Paulus a brilliant organizer. A general staff works under the premise that there is enough time to analyze before acting. A field commander works under the opposite premise, that time is never enough, and acting with incomplete information is better than not acting at all. Paulus had not internalized this second premise. The Auftragstaktik, which animated the German army, was a doctrine of initiative. Paulus was a man of procedure. The system had promoted him precisely because he was exceptional within the system. What the system had not measured was whether he was exceptional outside of it. The death of von Reichenau, the man who had been his mentor, his sponsor, and his support in the high command, was a blow that Paulus never publicly acknowledged, but that his subordinates perceived. Reichenau was the type of commander who could have balanced Paulus's strengths with the tactical aggression he lacked, who could have acted as a counterweight to Hitler in moments when the Führer imposed damaging operational decisions. With Reichenau dead just 3 days after Paulus took command, the new commander of the 6th Army was left alone, without the network of personal relationships and institutional authority that might have given him room to maneuver. The nervous tick in his left eye, which his subordinates would learn to interpret as a barometer of the pressure he was under, began to appear during the following months, in moments of greatest operational tension. By the summer of 1942, it was visible to anyone who looked at him for more than a few minutes. It didn't incapacitate him, but it was the outward symptom of an internal tension that the man could not, or would not, verbalize. His first major test in command came in May 1942. Marshal Semyon Timoshenko launched the Kharkov offensive with 640,000 soldiers, 1,200 tanks, and about 1,000 planes, using as a base the salient formed in Bavankovo in January. The Soviet objective was to encircle the 4th Panzer Army and the 6th Army, executing an enveloping maneuver from the salient to the north and south. During the first days, the pressure on the left flank of the 6th was intense. Paulus coordinated with the 1st Panzer Army of Generalfeldmarschall Ewald von Kleist for a pincer response. While the 8th Corps of the 6th Army maintained pressure on the salient from the north, the 1st Panzer Army attacked from the south, closing the encirclement in Bavankovo on May 22nd. 2 Soviet armies were trapped. The number of prisoners captured exceeded 240,000 men. Paulus received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross for that operation. It seemed that the man had found his measure in his army and his profession. What the success at Bavankovo did not show, because the conditions did not put it to the test, was how Paulus would respond when the circumstances were adverse, when the information was incomplete, when orders from above were wrong and the time to analyze them had run out. Those conditions would arrive in November 1942 within a Soviet encirclement in the ruins of a city on the banks of the Volga, and Paulus's responses to those conditions would seal the fate of 330,000 men. Operation Blue and the advance toward the Volga. In the summer of 1942, Hitler designed the Great German Offensive in the south, Operation Blue, Fall Blau. The goal was twofold and ambitious to the point of recklessness: to capture the oil fields of the Caucasus and cut off Soviet supply lines via the Volga River. Army Group South was split into 2 groups. Army Group A would advance toward the Caucasus, while Army Group B, which included the 6th Army and the 4th Panzer Army, would advance east and southeast. On June 28, 1942, Operation Blue began with an attack toward Voronezh. The bulk of the 6th Army did not advance until 2 days later, with the 2nd Hungarian Army and 1st Panzer Army protecting its left and right flanks, respectively. The first days confirmed the hopes. The Soviet front in southern Russia was collapsing. Timoshenko's forces were retreating instead of holding fixed positions, learning the bitter lesson of 1941. The encirclement pockets that had characterized the first year of the campaign were becoming more difficult to execute, but the advance was real. On July 23rd, Rostov-on-Don fell. This success led to the issuance of Führer Directive No. 45, which changed the execution order of Operation Blue, with consequences that some generals immediately interpreted as a symptom of overextension. It was ordered that Army Group A advance toward the Caucasus without waiting for Army Group B to secure the Volga. Both objectives would be taken simultaneously. And in the same document, the Sixth Army was assigned a task that the directive presented as secondary. But that would become the center of gravity for the entire war, advance solely towards Stalingrad and take the city. Stalingrad, an industrial city on the banks of the Volga, stretching more than 50 kilometers along the western riverbank, with enormous factories manufacturing T-34 tanks and heavy armament, even while shells rained down on its roofs. A working-class city, functional without the architectural beauty of Kiev or the vastness of Kharkov. But it had the river, and it had Stalin's name, and these two factors made it the place where the war would change direction forever. The rapid advance of the Sixth Army toward the Volga had created an exposed left flank of more than 560 kilometers to Voronezh, protected by the 2nd Hungarian Army, the 8th Italian Army, and the 3rd Romanian Army. On the right flank, the 4th Romanian Army. These troops, with inferior material capabilities and lacking modern anti-tank defenses, would determine the future of the Sixth Army in the months to come. No one in the German High Command wanted to see it, or perhaps no one had the courage to say it out loud. On August 23rd, the vanguard of the 16th Panzer Division sighted the Volga. On the same day, the 4th Luftflotte, the 4th Air Fleet of Generaloberst Wolfram Freiherr von Richthofen, bombed Stalingrad with approximately 600 aircraft. The civilian death toll from this bombing exceeded 40,000. The city was burning, and the Sixth Army was preparing to enter. The Rattenkrieg, the Rats' War in the ruins. No one who has studied the first days of the Sixth Army's assault on Stalingrad can fail to notice the gap between expectations and reality. The initial combats in August 1942 seemed to confirm what prior experience had promised. The Soviets were giving ground in the suburbs, fragmenting under the combined pressure of infantry and aviation, and the city appeared destined to fall within weeks. General Paulus calculated that organized resistance would soon collapse. General Feldmarschall von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, shared this optimism. Even in the OKW, the reports of the advance were read as the final phase of an operation that followed the logic of all the previous ones. It was not to be. Stalingrad was not France. It was not Belgium. It wasn't even the Ukrainian steppe, where the large encirclement pockets had worked with clockwork precision. Stalingrad was an industrial city of Soviet construction from the 1920s and 1930s, reinforced concrete buildings of 4- and 5-story structures designed not for aesthetics but for resistance to the climate and industrial weight, metal structures hundreds of meters long with steel and concrete walls, stone barns with 1-meter-thick walls, industrial drainage canals that cut the terrain into sectors of close combat. The city didn't have the wide avenues or open spaces that made tanks and artillery decisive in open fields. It was a labyrinth. And in a labyrinth, Auftragstaktik and Blitzkrieg lost their most fundamental advantage: speed. On September 13, 1942, General Lieutenant Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov took command of the 62nd Army from Nikita Khrushchev and Andrei Yeremenko, with an order that left no room for interpretation: defend Stalingrad to the death. Chuikov, 42 years old, had been in the Red Army since he was 15, when he enlisted as a volunteer in the Red Guard in 1918 during the Civil War. He had fought in the Winter War of 1939 to 1940 as an army commander, and that experience, in many ways a fiasco for Soviet forces, had shaped his understanding of what it meant to fight in conditions of reduced visibility, restricted terrain, and the tactical superiority of the adversary. He was explosive in demeanor, prone to expelling subordinates who did not act with the speed he demanded, and had an intuitive grasp of what set urban combat apart from any other form of warfare. Chuikov understood something his adversaries took weeks to accept. The only way to survive inside Stalingrad was to not leave space between their own lines and the German ones. The standard distance between enemy lines in conventional combat, typically between 300 and 500 meters, was the distance needed by German artillery to fire safely without hitting their own positions, and the distance needed by Stukas to identify targets and attack them without risking hitting friendly troops. If Soviet defenders got close enough to the attackers, that artillery and aviation lost their utility. Bombing the enemy meant bombing themselves. Chuikov called this hugging the enemy. His men practiced it with a ferocity that was beyond any manual of tactics. The practical implementation of this tactic transformed the battlefield into something the Germans had never encountered. Soviet sapper units turned every building into an independent fortress. They would demolish internal staircases to prevent vertical movement, block doors with rubble, open loopholes in separating walls between apartments to create fire networks covering hallways and inner courtyards. Snipers operated from positions in the upper floors and basements simultaneously, keeping German attackers in a state of constant alertness that wore down concentration and consumed the soldiers' psychological energy with an effectiveness no frontal assault could match. German assault engineers, the Pioniere, who entered a building never knew if it was completely clear or if there were still Soviet soldiers alive on the floor below, on the roof, or behind the wall they had just crossed. On September 13, 1942, the 71st, 76th and 295th German infantry divisions advanced toward the city center, defended at the time by around 20,000 of Chuikov's men. The 71st Division reached the city center and captured the main railway station. However, a counterattack by the 13th Guards Rifle Division under General Major Alexander Rodimtsev, which had crossed the Volga on barges under German fire the previous night, preserved the central dock, the vital point for maintaining the flow of reinforcements and supplies from the eastern riverbank. Of that Soviet division, only 320 men out of the initial 10,000 survived the entire battle. But the dock was held. Control of the Volga was the heart of the Soviet defensive strategy. The eastern bank of the river remained in Soviet hands throughout the battle, and from that bank came night after night the reinforcements, ammunition, food and medical supplies that kept the 62nd Army alive. The ferries crossed under fire from German artillery and aviation. Many sank. Those that made it unloaded under fire and returned with the wounded. The river in September and October was at temperatures that killed anyone who fell into the water within minutes. The barges navigated between the blocks of ice that began to form in November. The logistical bridge over the Volga was fragile, intermittent, and costly in lives, but it was never entirely broken. The Sixth Army bled in September and October. The divisions that had entered the battle with thousands of men each were reduced to skeletal remains, but often more lethal because the survivors were the most experienced and adapted to the specific type of combat in the city. The figures from the 14th Panzer Corps are revealing, by the end of September, the 16th Panzer Division, one of the elite units of the 6th that had reached the Volga in August, had fewer than 2,000 effective combatants. The 24th Panzer Division, another of the jewels of the 6th, had lost more than 60% of its officers since the beginning of the fighting in the city. Some regiments were fighting with fewer than 100 effective soldiers, the equivalent of a nominal company. The factories that named the combat sectors became the epicenters of the most brutal battles. The Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, with its steel and concrete halls 800 meters long, its assembly pits several meters deep, and its overhead cranes still hanging over the shattered battlefield, was the scene of fighting that lasted weeks and was literally measured in meters per day. The Barakadi gun factory, where the Soviets had been producing artillery until days before the Germans arrived, was a complex of industrial buildings that the defenders had converted into a fortress of concrete and steel that required an enormous effort to be taken, room by room. The Red October Steel Factory, in the northern sector, was a conglomerate of smelting furnaces, warehouses and administrative buildings that changed hands in some sectors several times a day. Inside the factory it was different, wrote a German corporal who served in the fighting for Barakadi. Outside there was sky, even if it was grey. Inside there was only darkness, cement dust, and the noise, always the noise. The shots inside those spaces sounded different, drier, closer. You'd go deaf after a while and fight in silence, looking at shadows. On October 14, 1942, Paulus launched what would be the most concentrated assault of the entire battle. 5 full divisions, the 14th Panzer Division, the 305th and 389th Infantry Divisions, the 100th Jaeger Division, and the 60th Motorized Infantry Division, with more than 90,000 men and 300 tanks concentrated on a front of 4 kilometers, with massive support from the Luftwaffe, which carried out over 3,000 combat sorties on the most intensive days. The objective was the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory and the surrounding industrial area. In the first hours, the overwhelming weight of the strike shattered several Soviet battalions. The 14th Panzer Division broke the lines of the 37th Guards Division and advanced northeast, reaching the edge of the factory and splitting the 62nd Army into 2 sectors. For a moment, it seemed the resistance would finally collapse. The 138th Siberian Rifle Division arrived, crossing the Volga on rafts during the nights of October 15th and 16th under continuous German fire, with water temperatures close to freezing. Every man who crossed that river knew that the chances of their barge being sunk before reaching the shore were real and calculable. They crossed anyway. This division, and the fresh units that followed in the days after, injected exactly the kind of resistance capacity needed to prevent the sector from collapsing. The Germans took the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory. They took most of Barricadi. They occupied half of the Red October factory. But the 62nd Army survived. By the end of October 1942, the state of the Sixth Army was that of a force that had gained nearly all the available ground and consumed an irreplaceable portion of its combat potential in the process. It controlled 90% of the city, but that percentage represented destroyed buildings, useless rubble, and terrain that had no operational value. The remaining 10% in Soviet hands was a narrow strip along the Volga riverbank, with a depth in some sectors of only 200 or 300 meters. But that strip led to the Volga, and as long as it led to the Volga, reinforcements would continue to arrive. "We were no longer an army," recalled one of the survivors of those weeks with the flat voice of someone who had learned to speak of such things without letting the tremor show. "We were small groups, 4 men here, 8 there. Each building was a separate world. You didn't know what was happening 50 meters from you. You heard shots and didn't know if they were yours or the enemy's. Sometimes it didn't matter to know." On November 11th, 1942, the last German attempt to take the city before the winter came was the assault on the coastal strip in the southern sector, where the forces of the 71st Infantry Division attempted to push the remnants of the 62nd Army toward the river in the central dock sector. They managed to advance to within 300 meters of the Volga at some points, but they never reached the water. And the men who attempted this final advance had already been fighting for weeks with 1/10 of the personnel they had started the campaign with. At that very moment, hundreds of kilometers to the north and south of the Volga, the Red Army was finishing the secret concentration of the forces that would make all of this irrelevant. The time the Sixth Army had spent inside the city, every day of urban combat, every decimated battalion, every tank lost in the hallways of a factory that was worth no tank, had also been the time that Vasilevsky and Zhukov needed to prepare what was to come on November 19th. The trap closes. Operation Uranus. On September 13th, 1942, while the Sixth Army began to push into Stalingrad, a different plan was presented to Stalin in Moscow. Not a reinforcement of the city's defense, but the encirclement of the attacker. Its authors were General Georgy Zhukov and General Polkovnik Alexander Vasilevsky, chief of the Soviet General Staff. The concept was brutally elegant. Instead of trying to defeat the Sixth Army inside Stalingrad, the idea was to surround it from the outside. The flanks of the Sixth Army were protected by Axis ally units whose commanders knew better than anyone their own vulnerability. Romanian General of Army Petre Dumitrescu, in command of the 3rd Romanian Army on the northern flank, had repeatedly requested additional anti-tank weapons from the Germans. Heeresgruppe B sent him 67.5cm PaK 97/38 anti-tank guns. Dumitrescu replied that it was not enough. It wasn't. The Soviets knew this. The maskirovka, deception and camouflage, was carried out with a meticulousness the Germans had not seen before. For weeks, large masses of infantry, tanks and artillery were secretly concentrated to the north and south of Stalingrad, in the sectors defended by the Romanians. The movements were carried out only at night. Trains advanced without lights. Oberst Reinhard Gehlen, head of intelligence for Fremde Heere Ost, Foreign Armies East, had detected signs of concentration on the Don bridges in front of the 3rd Romanian Army, but dismissed the threat as limited. The 9 panzer divisions that OKH kept as a strategic reserve were not sent south. They stayed in front of the Rzhev salient, where Galen believed the main strike would occur. On November 19, 1942, at 7:30 a.m., with temperatures several degrees below zero and thick fog limiting visibility to 200 meters, the Southwestern and Don fronts initiated an 80-minute artillery preparation. About 3,500 Soviet guns opened fire. The fog and snow prevented forward observers from adjusting the fire, so the artillery simply fired on known or estimated positions. The damage to the 3rd Romanian Army was real, but not devastating. What destroyed them was what came after. The 5th Tank Army of Lieutenant General Prokofy Romanenko advanced in 4 assault groups. The 47th Guards Rifle Division, supported by 64 tanks, destroyed the 14th Romanian Infantry Division. The 50th Guards Rifle Division, with 74 tanks, collapsed the 5th Romanian Infantry Division. By noon, the tank brigades of the 1st Tank Corps and the 26th Tank Corps were flowing through the holes in the Romanian front. The sudden appearance of nearly 200 tanks caused the complete collapse of the 14th Romanian Infantry Division. The center of the Romanian army disintegrated. On November 20th, the Stalingrad front launched its own arm of the encirclement from the south, with the 51st Army of Major General Nikolai Trufanov and the 57th Army of Major General Fedor Tolbugin attacking the right flank of the 4th Panzer Army. The weak Romanian divisions of the 6th Corps quickly collapsed. Tolbugin committed the 4th Mechanized Corps of Major General Vasily Volsky, which advanced westward against minimal resistance. On November 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel Georgy N. Filipov led a column of 5 T-34 tanks, 2 motorized rifle companies in trucks, 5 armored vehicles and 3 captured German vehicles toward the pontoon bridge over the Don at Berezovsky, northwest of Kalach. Pretending to be a German column, Filipov reached the bridge before dawn. The Guards, a military police unit, an 8.8-centimeter anti-aircraft gun and personnel from an engineering school did not recognize the deception until the Soviet soldiers were already on the bridge. The 8.8-centimeter gun destroyed 2 T-34 tanks before being neutralized. The bridge was captured intact. Filipov established a defensive perimeter and waited for 11 hours, alone with his small force, until reinforcements arrived. He was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. On November 23, 1942, the Soviet encirclement arms closed to the east of Kalach. The 6th Army, 330,000 men in 22 divisions, along with troops from other Corps and Axis Allied units, was completely surrounded. It was the first time in history that a complete German field army had been trapped. More than 30,000 Axis soldiers escaped to the south before the pincers fully closed. Inside the Kessel, the cauldron, as the Germans called the pocket, about 284,000 men remained. The paper fortress, the encirclement and the airlift. The initial reaction inside the Kessel was one of disbelief. Many officers and soldiers did not immediately understand the magnitude of what had happened. Communications were confused, reports contradictory, but those who understood right away, the commanders of the more veteran divisions, the staff officers who knew the maps and the numbers, felt something that very few described in their diaries with the correct word. The word was despair. When I realized the encirclement was real, that it was not a temporary movement of the enemy but a closed trap, I stared at the map for a long time, wrote a lieutenant colonel whose name did not survive the war. I didn't think about Germany. I didn't think about my family. I thought about the men who were sleeping 100 meters from where I was standing, who still didn't know what I already knew. Paulus immediately requested permission to attempt a breakout to the west before the encirclement was consolidated. On the night of November 23rd at 11:45 p.m., he sent a radio signal to OKW requesting freedom of action, the euphemism for permission to break out of the encirclement. Hitler's response the next day was unequivocal. The 6th Army would stay in position, be supplied by airlift, and wait for von Manstein to break the encirclement from the outside. The promise of the airlift had an involuntary architect, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, who had assured Hitler that his air force could supply the 6th by air. He did so without consulting technical experts, basing it on the precedent of the Demyansk encirclement the previous winter, where the Luftwaffe had supplied 6 trapped divisions 96,000 men, with an average of 300 tons per day for 3 months. But the comparison was flawed. The Sixth Army was more than 3 times larger than the force trapped at Demyansk. Its headquarters calculated that it would need at least 750 tons per day to operate. General-Lieutenant Martin Fiebig, commander of the 8th Fliegerkorps, had already told Paulus on November 21st that the Luftwaffe did not have the means to supply the Sixth Army by air. When the airlift began on November 24th, Fiebig only had 25 operational Ju-52 transports in theatre, each capable of carrying about 2 tons. The first day of the airlift delivered 86 tons. The first 5 days totaled 269 tons. The temperatures in the Stalingrad area during November and December of 1942 ranged between 0 and -10 degrees Celsius during the day, dropping to -35 during the coldest nights. The Pitomnik airfield inside the Kessel began receiving flights. Tatsinskaya, 237 kilometers away, was designated as the main base for the airlift. The army inside the Kessel began to ration itself. The daily bread rations were reduced first to 400 grams, then to 200. The 25,000 horses of the artillery units, which the soldiers needed to move the pieces across the snowy terrain, were sacrificed for food. When the horses were gone, whatever could be found was eaten. Of the 58,000 Soviet auxiliaries, the Hiwis, prisoners who had agreed to serve as labor and logistical support for the German army, more than 19,000 remained inside the Kessel, and some fought alongside the German units. The 3,500 Soviet prisoners the Germans held in 2 detention camps inside the Kessel survived in even worse conditions. Of that total, it is estimated that fewer than 20 survived. On December 9, 1942, General Kurt Zeitzler, newly appointed Chief of Staff of OKH, began consuming the same daily rations of calories as the soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, in an attempt to persuade Hitler of the urgency of the situation. He visibly lost weight in days. Hitler did not change his position. The attempted rescue, Wintergewitter. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein arrived in Novocherkassk on November 26th and activated Heeresgruppe Don. He had few forces available, but those arriving were of first-rate quality. General Major Erhard Raus brought the 6th Panzer Division from France with 150 operational tanks. The 23rd Panzer Division arrived from the Caucasus, though with reduced resources. The 17th Panzer Division, with only 57 tanks, was promised but took time to arrive. On December 12, 1942, at 6:30 a.m., Hoth launched Operation Wintergewitter, Winter Storm. The sky was clear. Visibility was excellent. The 6th Panzer Division, with 141 tanks, was the Schwerpunkt, the spearhead, pushing north along the railway line. The first day was encouraging. Hoth advanced about 20 kilometers and shattered Soviet rifle divisions. The Luftwaffe was able to provide close air support with Stuka sorties. But starting on December 13th, General Major Vasily Volsky committed the 4th Mechanized Corps to defensive positions around Verkhnechumsky. What followed was a 5-day battle that consumed the time von Manstein didn't have. The 4th Mechanized Corps suffered enormous losses, more than 5,500 casualties and around 70 tanks, but its resistance was brilliant. It allowed the 2nd Guards Army of Lieutenant General Rodion Malinovsky to reach the Mishkova River and form a solid defensive line with 5 fresh rifle divisions. On December 19th, the 6th Panzer Division finally crossed the Mishkova and captured an intact bridge at Vasilvyevka. It was 48 kilometers from the southern perimeter of the Kessel. This was the closest the rescue would get. Von Manstein sent a radio message to Paulus that same night instructing him to initiate the breakout southward. The codename was Donnerschlag, Thunder. General Hans Valentin Huber had at least 60 operational panzers and had started to concentrate the 14th Panzer Corps at the southwestern corner of the Kessel. The distance to cover was about 50 kilometers. It was risky, but it was possible. Paulus did not order the breakout. The decision, or non-decision, of Paulus during those hours is one of the most studied debates in the military history of World War II. His defenders point out that Hitler had expressly denied authorization for a retreat. His critics argue that at that moment von Manstein was implicitly giving him permission, and that there were German commanders who in similar situations acted without waiting for formal approval from Hitler. General der Artillerie Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, commander of the 51st Army Corps inside the Kessel, had attempted to force the issue on November 23rd by issuing his own orders for preparing a breakout. Paulus tolerated this act of insubordination without consequences. What Paulus did believe, with a sincerity that his later memoirs did not conceal, was that the 6th Army did not have the fuel or the fighting capacity to survive a 50-kilometer advance in open terrain during the winter, abandoning all its heavy equipment. He thought that most of the men who survived the breakout attempt would reach the other side without equipment, without organization, and without the possibility of being reorganized into a fighting force. He may have been right. But not attempting it meant that everyone would die. By December 23rd, von Manstein recognized the reality. The 6th Panzer Division was withdrawn from the Mishkova salient to support the Cheer Front, which was collapsing under the impact of Operation Little Saturn. On December 24th, the Red Army launched its Kotelnikovo offensive with the 2nd Guards Army and the 7th Tank Corps of General Rotmistrov. Hoth's forces, already decimated, withdrew. Kotelnikovo was captured on December 29th. There would be no rescue. Little Saturn and the collapse of the flanks. While Wintergewitter advanced and failed at the Mishkova, another element of the Soviet plan was unfolding on the northern flank. Operation Little Saturn, a scaled-down version of the original Operation Saturn that the Stavka planners had designed, launched on December 16, 1942, two Soviet armies against the 8th Italian Army of General Italo Garibaldi, which was defending a 125-kilometer sector along the Don. The 8th Italian Army consisted of 10 infantry divisions in 3 corps, the 2nd, 35th and Alpine Corps, along with the 298th German Infantry Division. The only armour available as a reserve for the Italians was a provisional formation called the 27th Panzer Division, which was little more than a regimental-sized battle group with 65 mostly obsolete tanks. Vatutin began the operation at 8 a.m. on December 16th with a 90-minute artillery preparation, which was practically ineffective due to the dense fog. The first day did not produce a decisive breakthrough, but on the second day, December 17th, the 17th Tank Corps was introduced into the gap between the Italian divisions Cossaria and Ravenna. The defense broke. The 25th Tank Corps of General Pavlov and the 24th Tank Corps of General Vasily Badanov poured into the open space. On December 24th, the 24th Tank Corps of Badanov, with 58 operational tanks under a sky that German Stukas had been relentlessly attacking for days, reached the Tatsinskaya airfield. The airfield was filled with nearly 200 transport aircraft. Luftwaffe personnel were completely caught by surprise. The first Soviet shells triggered panic. The planes began taking off in emergency conditions, some without cleared runways. More than 50 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The supply depots accumulated for the airlift caught fire. The airlift to Stalingrad was severely damaged. Badanov reported his position to Vatutin. He had completed his mission, but his tanks were out of fuel and ammunition. Vatutin had no means to resupply him immediately. On December 25th, General Hermann Balk's 11th Panzer Division surrounded Badanov's corps and began systematically destroying it. On the night of December 27th to 28th, Badanov made an unauthorized breakout and reached the Soviet lines with 9 tanks and around 900 men. The collapse of the 8th Italian Army and the loss of Tatsinskaya dismantled the last external support for the 6th Army. Von Manstein organized emergency defensive lines along the Donets with what was left available. But for the 6th Army inside the Kessel, the message was clear. There would be no rescue, there would be no corridor. Only the cold, the hunger, and the time they had left remained. Operation Ring, the final blow. The new year of 1943 arrived in the Kessel of Stalingrad with temperatures regularly dropping to -20 degrees Celsius during the day and -35 at night. The daily bread ration was reduced to 80 grams on December 30th. The army had 103 operational tanks and 35 assault guns by mid-December, but the fuel necessary to move them ran out faster than it could arrive. On January 7th, 1943, General Polkovnik Konstantin Rokossovsky, now in command of the Don Front, which had taken on the responsibility of the encirclement, sent an ultimatum to Paulus through special emissaries. The terms were specific: normal rations, medical treatment for the wounded and sick, repatriation to any country after the war. Paulus rejected the offer. Hitler's orders were equally specific: resist to the death. On January 10, 1943, at 8:05 a.m., Rokossovsky initiated Operation Ring, Koltso. General Polkovnik Nikolai Voronov, Chief of Artillery for the Red Army and Stavka representative, had concentrated 500 guns and howitzers plus 450 multiple rocket launchers in a 12-kilometer-wide attack sector. It was the highest artillery density achieved by the Red Army up until that point in the war. Unlike previous operations, the sky was clear and visibility was excellent. Soviet forward observers were able to adjust fire with precision. The 55-minute bombardment that opened Operation Ring destroyed German positions across the entire western front of the Kessel, especially in the sector of the 44th Infantry Division. The 5 rifle divisions of the 65th Army under General Batov advanced against the 44th Division. The Germans resisted position by position, sometimes engaging in hand-to-hand combat. 4 German battalions were destroyed, but Hube's panzer reserves arrived in time to contain the most dangerous advances, and the Western Front held on that first day. January 11th was different. Hauptmann Rudolf Hayen, with 4 tanks, awaited the advance of the 57th Guards Tank Regiment with its British-made Churchill tanks. In a fight lasting minutes, Hayen destroyed 18 of the 21 Churchills before the attack was contained. It was the kind of tactical action the 6th Army could still produce, but Hube lost 30 of his 46 tanks and 11 of his 18 heavy anti-tank guns in just the first 2 days of Operation Ring. On January 16th, the 51st Guards Rifle Division captured the Pitomnik airfield. The 6th Army lost its main airfield. The Luftwaffe was forced to withdraw its escort fighters. Transport flights continued unprotected toward the secondary airfield of Gumrak. On January 23rd, Gumrak also fell. The last German flight left the Kessel at 10:45 that morning. From that moment, resupply depended exclusively on airdrops, most of which fell on Soviet-controlled territory. Rokossovsky paused on January 17th to replenish ammunition and reorganize his units. The Don Front had suffered approximately 26,000 casualties in 1 week of fighting and lost half of its tanks. The pause cost the Soviet offensive some momentum, but the final outcome was not in doubt. On January 21st, the offensive resumed. 4 rifle divisions from the 65th Army and all available artillery struck the German line around Baburkin. The 44th Infantry Division, already reduced to a third of its strength, could not hold. The western front of the Kessel began to collapse. On January 26, 1943, at 11 a.m., the 21st Army under Major General Chistyakov broke through the remnants of the 8th Army Corps and linked up with the 62nd Army of Chuikov at Mamayev-Kurgan. The Kessel was split in 2. Strecker's 11th Army Corps was isolated in the north in the ruins of the tractor factory and barricade. The bulk of what remained of the 6th Army, including Paulus and his staff, was trapped in the southern pocket, around the Univermag stores in the city center. On January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, Friedrich Paulus was promoted to General Feldmarschall by radio. It was simultaneously an honor and an implicit order of suicide. No German field marshal had ever been captured. Paulus told a subordinate who recorded his words, "I have no intention of shooting myself because of this Bohemian corporal," referring to Hitler. He chose surrender. The end. Surrender and captivity. The morning of January 31st, 1943, the Univermag warehouse building in the southern center of Stalingrad was the last headquarters of Friedrich Paulus. In the basement of this building, among mattresses, scattered papers, and the sour smell of the wounded, the newly promoted General Feldmarschall awaited the end. Soldiers from the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade of the 64th Army, under General Mikhail Shumilov, surrounded the building. At 7:15 a.m., Paulus and his staff emerged into the open and surrendered. In the northern part of the Kessel, General Karl Strecker initially refused to surrender. His 11th Armee Corps, about 50,000 men scattered across the remains of 7 divisions, entrenched in the ruins of the tractor factory and barricade, held out for 2 more days. On February 1st, 1943, at 8:30 a.m., the Don Front launched the final assault with the 65th and 66th Armies, preceded by a 90-minute artillery bombardment. The 16th Air Army bombed the German positions with all available capacity. The northern and western fronts of the pocket were shattered. About 4,000 Germans were killed or wounded in the final assault. More than 20,000 were captured. Strecker's subordinates initiated surrender talks without his authorization. On February 2nd, 1943, at 7 a.m., Strecker finally agreed to surrender. At 9:20 a.m., Heeresgruppe Don received the last message from Stalingrad. The resistance had ended. The Sixth Army no longer existed. Of the 284,000 men trapped in the Kessel on November 23rd, approximately 150,000 had died during the encirclement from combat, cold, hunger, or disease. The Soviets claim to have captured 91,000 prisoners. Other estimates suggest the number may have reached 107,800, including about 700 Croats and approximately 3,000 Romanians. Of those prisoners, most died in the following months during the marches to the camps and in the conditions of the camps themselves. Many were sent to Pokrovsky Camp, number 127 near Saratov. Of 8,007 prisoners sent there, 1,526 died on the way, and another 4,663 in the first 6 weeks after arrival. Others were sent to Beketovka Camp number 108, where they were employed in clearing the battlefield rubble. The officers were distributed into 3 camps: Oranki number 74, Yelabuga number 97, and Krasnogorsk number 27, where they were interrogated and some processed for war crimes. Some disabled prisoners were released in 1947 and 1948. Most were not released until after Stalin's death in 1953. Only about 6,000 of the prisoners captured at Stalingrad ever returned to Germany. The last group returned in 1955, 12 years after the surrender. "I was no longer afraid of dying," wrote a German soldier on a piece of paper found many years later among the ruins of the city. "I was afraid of dying alone, with no one knowing my name.